thrown into a chaos of swirling dust and pounding hooves, a wild Mustang Stallion found himself fighting to outrun a relentless helicopter roaring overhead. The thunder of panicked horses surrounded him, driving him to push his muscular legs to their limit as he struggled not to be trampled by the press of bodies. The air felt thick with fear and desperation, and all around him, he sensed the terror of his fellow Mustangs who, like him, were thrust into an impossible situation. He swerved to avoid crashing into a terrified mare on his left, and nearly collided with a sturdy bay stallion on his right. In his mind, there was only one focus, one driving need: to find his mate Ember and their young colt Ash. He could barely hear their neighs above the cacophony, but he refused to let that faint hope fade. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. The dust whipped his nostrils, stinging his eyes and coating every inch of his sleek black hide. Helicopter blades sliced the air above in a roar, and that oppressive roar seemed to pulse in his ears like an unending thunder. He snorted, shaking his head violently as he tried to rid himself of the choking dust, but it was no use. His heart thundered in his chest, and he could feel the raw panic coursing through the herd. Some horses stumbled under the push of so many bodies. Others veered wildly to avoid the chaos, only to crash into one another in the madness. His name was Riot. Born in a harsh corner of the desert, he'd grown into a proud stallion with powerful hindquarters and a striking black coat that glistened in the sunlight. He was known to be fearless in the face of threats, but now, as the helicopter raged overhead, even his courage was tested. He had Ember and Ash to think about, and that thought lent him a deeper reserve of strength. They were somewhere among this stampede, but he couldn't see them. Ember's scent was lost in the dust and sweat of the swirling mass of Mustangs. Occasionally he thought he heard Ash's trembling whinny, a higher pitch than the rest, but it was impossible to tell. The machines had come earlier that morning, rising like some monstrous predator over the horizon. Without warning, they had chased the herd across the open range, driving them into a panicked sprint that offered little direction or escape. Riot tried to fight against the overwhelming flow, turning sharply to break to the left and circle back. A clang of metal caught his attention through the swirling dust. A holding pen had been set up not far away, and the wranglers were funneling the herd toward its gates. Horses were being corralled, forced into cramped spaces. The stench of fear built on the wind. Riot spun around a large roan mare that nearly crashed into him, but he used the momentum to keep himself angled away from the pen's entrance. The wranglers yelled, swung ropes, and tried to force them forward. Another helicopter joined in overhead, pinning them from every direction. Riot let out a furious snort and pinned his ears back, refusing to submit. If he got trapped in that place, he feared it would mean losing Ember and Ash forever. He had to stay free, and he had to find them. Suddenly, Ember's voice sounded somewhere to his right. Her panicked whinny cut through the din, reaching him even over the engines and shouting. Riot's ears perked. Hope surged in him like a wildfire. He twisted his body, slamming his shoulder against a smaller horse by mistake, but forging a path through. The dust cleared just enough for him to catch a glimpse of a sleek, chestnut-coated mare with a bold white blaze. Ember. His heart jolted with recognition. He saw her fierce eyes dart in every direction, searching for an escape, and searching, no doubt, for him. But she wasn't alone. A trembling, long-legged colt pressed against her side, clinging to his mother's flank. Ash looked so vulnerable, so frightened. Riot let out a shrill whinny, calling to them. Ember snapped her head around, eyes going wide, relief flashing across her features for the briefest moment. Then she was swept forward by the crush of bodies surging toward the pen, with no space to turn around. Riot lunged after them. He shoved past the thick-chested bay and narrowly avoided the rope that a wrangler lashed out, trying to snare his neck. Rage coursed through him. He bared his teeth and snapped at the rope, adrenaline giving him an explosive burst of strength. The wrangler fell back, cursing, but the moment's distraction slowed Riot enough that Ember and Ash were forced deeper into the corral area. Riot watched in horror as the metal gates closed behind them, the clang ringing out like a prison door in his ears. He skidded to a halt just beyond reach, hooves churning the dust beneath him, chest heaving. For a breathless second, everything seemed to slow. Ember locked eyes with him from behind the bars, her panic turned to desperation. Ash whinnied, stumbling over his own legs in fear. Riot's ears swiveled back, rage simmering in him, but he recognized that he was on the wrong side of those bars, free but separated. The roar overhead deepened as the helicopter pivoted, bearing down to push him and a few other stray horses toward the pen. Riot refused. He snarled in his own equine way, rearing up. His powerful front legs slashed the air. He didn't think about the bullets that might come, or the ropes that might entangle him. His instincts, ancient and wild, screamed for him to break away, to run. Taking advantage of a gap that opened when two terrified maras veered left, he made a break for it. He galloped at full speed across the open desert, his mane whipping like a banner of defiance behind him. The men shouted, and a rifle shot rang out. A bullet whizzed past his flank, grazing him just enough to singe the flesh and draw blood. Pain blazed along his hip, but he didn't stop. Fear and fury gave his lungs more power, and he pushed himself to the limit, carrying him beyond the capture zone. He raced until his lungs burned, until his legs felt like molten lead. Only when the helicopter's roar faded behind the distant hills did he dare to slow. He trembled with exhaustion, sweat rolling off his black sides. His eyes rolled, searching the horizon for any sign of pursuit. At last, he stood alone in the desert, panting. Blood trickled from the shallow wound, stinging in the open air. He swung his head around to sniff the wound, wincing. It wasn't deep, but it would sap his strength if he didn't rest soon. Rest, however, was a luxury he couldn't afford. Somewhere back there in that corral, Ember and Ash were locked away, and Riot had no way of knowing what would become of them if he didn't act. He couldn't simply charge back in. The fences were high, the men armed, the helicopters swift. He had to plan, or at least gather his strength before attempting something so brazen. He was a wild stallion, but he wasn't without cunning. He'd faced predators and rival stallions. This, though, was different. The Wranglers had technology and weaponry on their side. Riot's heart thundered as he stepped forward, each hoof pressing into the dust that still hung in the air. He glanced behind him once more, remembering how Ember had looked at him, trusting him to find a way. He needed water. With a trembling snort, he forced himself to move, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. The desert stretched out before him, a vast expanse of red-brown earth and scattered sagebrush. The sun blazed from high above, making the shimmering heat haze dance on the horizon. He followed a small canyon he knew from countless runs with the herd. It often led to a dry creek bed, but sometimes, if the rains had been kind, there'd be a trickle of water left. Step after step, he pushed on, occasionally stumbling over a rock or a patch of uneven ground. Each time, he forced himself to stay upright, to keep going. Quitting was not an option. At last, he smelled moisture, faint but real. He pressed forward, swallowing dust and trying not to let the dryness of his throat distract him. The canyon walls towered on either side, blocking some of the harshest sunlight. He heard the drone of a single-engine plane in the distance, more men maybe, scanning for runaways. He flattened himself against the rough sandstone, pressed into the shadows, and waited with bated breath until the plane's sound faded. Then he continued, taking each step with caution, mindful that any sign of him might bring the helicopters back. He reached a small pool that had collected in the rock's hollow. It wasn't much, brackish and stagnant, but it was water. Riot lowered his muzzle and drank deeply, grateful for anything to soothe the scorching dryness in his mouth. The water tasted foul, but he drained what he could. It was enough to steady his shaking legs. Satisfied for the moment, he turned his attention to his wound. Blood still oozed from the graze, and he licked at it, cleaning the worst of the dust and grit away with his rough tongue. He tested his hind leg with a few careful steps. It would hold, but the pain was sharp and would slow him. He needed a plan. A direct assault on the pen seemed suicidal. Even if he managed to leap the fence, he'd be cornered by men with ropes and guns. He remembered how the gates had slammed, how Ember and Ash had cried out. The helplessness made his blood boil. He snorted, pawing at the ground, sending a small spray of pebbles rattling against the canyon wall. He had to be cunning. Perhaps he could follow from a distance, track where they might take the horses, and then, in a moment of opportunity, strike. But he had to do so quickly. There was no telling how soon they'd load his family onto trailers and drive them away from this land forever. He thought of Ember's strong spirit, the fierce love in her eyes whenever she watched over Ash. He couldn't lose them. His powerful heart hammered in his chest, a reminder that even alone, he carried his own strength. That same strength had allowed him to break free. Now it had to serve him again. Though the desert was scorching, the shadows in the canyon offered some relief. He decided to lie down just for a moment. The adrenaline crash hit him hard as soon as his legs folded. A tremor of fatigue washed through his muscles. He lowered his head, ears twitching to pick up any sound of threat. Only the soft sigh of the wind through the canyon greeted him. His eyes drooped, heavy from the frantic chase and the grueling hours of tension. But before he drifted too far, an image of Ash's frightened gaze jolted him awake. He jerked his head upright, refusing to surrender to sleep. There was no time. Cautiously, he rose again, ignoring the ache in his flank. If the Wranglers were thorough, they'd probably try to track him down as well. It might be safer to keep moving, to circle wide around the capture site and figure out where they'd move the Mustangs next. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he limped forward, following the canyon deeper into the wild. The walls grew higher, the passage narrower. This route was seldom traveled by the herd, often avoided due to predators and the tricky footing. Rocks tumbled from ridges high above. Lizards scurried across the warm stones. Vultures circled overhead, perhaps sensing that any living creature here might be too weak to last. But if he could slip through unnoticed, it might bring him out on the other side of the desert, near another water source. He pressed on. After an hour of careful walking, he caught sight of a small gap in the canyon wall. It opened to a wide vista of rocky plains. On the horizon, he spotted the faint shapes of trucks moving in a line, sending clouds of dust billowing behind them. That had to be where they were taking the captured Mustangs. His heart lurched. Feeling a surge of determination, he quickened his pace, ignoring the throbbing protest in his flank. He would follow them from a distance, keep track of where Ember and Ash went. Then, when the moment was right, he'd do whatever it took to free them. Crossing the rocky plains was no small feat. The heat intensified as the sun climbed higher, and the open space left him exposed. He tried to keep to low ground, moving behind any ridge or scrub that could offer the slightest camouflage. The trucks rumbled ahead, sometimes pausing, sometimes driving for miles, always accompanied by those mechanical beasts in the sky. Riot watched with a mix of dread and anger. It felt unnatural to see his kind driven like cattle, locked into machines of metal and carried away. But he never lost them from his sight, and by late afternoon, he saw them halt at a large operations site. The buzz of engines told him more vehicles were there, no doubt corrals and loading ramps for shipping the Mustangs out to who knew where. He found a vantage point behind a clump of juniper that hid him from prying eyes, and there he waited, muzzle lowered to blend into the scrub. He saw men leading the horses into separate pens, sorting them by color, age, or condition. He couldn't tell if Ember and Ash were among those being sorted. There were so many bodies, so much noise, so many men waving their arms. Riot's nostrils flared in frustration. He flicked his tail, lashing at the ground. His entire being itched to charge forward, to break open those fences and free them all. But there were too many men, too many trucks, and far too many guns. He was but one horse, battered and wounded. Night fell slowly, bringing with it a slight cooling of the desert air. Riot stayed put, dozing fitfully. In the distance, floodlights lit up the corrals, revealing the silhouettes of many Mustangs trapped behind chain-link fences. The men wore hats and carried flashlights, checking on the animals, occasionally tossing hay. Riot's stomach growled, but he ignored the hunger. He had to stay focused. The hours dragged on, and eventually the lights dimmed, leaving only a handful of dim security lamps and the soft glow of the moon. Most of the men retreated to trailers or tents, presumably to sleep. Riot decided this was the best chance he had to get closer. His injury pulled at him, but he forced his muscles to obey. He moved quietly, letting the darkness mask his presence. Drawing nearer to the corrals, he sniffed the air, hoping to catch Ember's familiar scent. The breeze was unpredictable, sometimes swirling his own smell back toward him, and he stomped a hoof in vexation. He crept behind a parked truck, flattening his body as low as he could manage, heart pounding like a war drum. Just then, a shift in the wind brought him a painfully sweet thread of scent. Ember, definitely. He recognized the warmth that was uniquely hers, that subtle mixture of desert sage and the salt of her sweat. The last time he'd scented her so strongly, they were side by side, protective of Ash during a rare lightning storm that had swept the plateau. Now, that memory seared him with sorrow and resolve. She was near. He peered through a gap in the fencing, scanning the darkness for her shape. The gloom and the mesh made it difficult. A few steps ahead, he saw a cluster of maras pressed together, dozing with their heads low. He pressed his muzzle to the fence, letting out a soft nicker. One of the maras stirred, but it wasn't Ember. He tried again, a quiet, hopeful sound. Suddenly, a shape stirred at the far side of the pen, ears pricking. A soft, answering whinny filtered through the fence, uncertain but hopeful. Riot recognized Ember's voice in an instant. He nickered again, more urgently this time. She moved closer, emerging from the cluster of bodies. Her eyes, reflecting faint moonlight, widened when she recognized him. His heart nearly burst at the sight of her. But then a wave of anguish and rage swept through him as he realized Ash wasn't at her side. He glanced behind her, looking for the small form. Ember whickered sadly, tossing her head toward another pen. Panic seized him. Where was his son? Why had they separated them? Riot let out a low rumble of protest. Ember flicked her ears, fighting to stay calm. She turned her muzzle to the side, gesturing with her entire head that the colt had been taken somewhere else. The bitter truth of captivity slammed into Riot. These men would shuffle families apart without a second thought, with no regard for the bonds that wild horses formed. Ember pressed her head to the fence as though trying to reach him, but the chain links kept them apart. Riot gently touched his nose to hers through one of the diamonds in the mesh. This moment of connection was heartbreakingly brief but infused him with renewed determination. They had to get out. He didn't know how yet, but he couldn't leave them to be transported away, possibly sold off, or worse. He looked around, scanning the perimeter for any weaknesses. The fence rose high, topped with additional barriers that would be tough even for a powerful stallion like him to clear. Men patrolled occasionally, and the hum of trucks and generators never fully died. The corrals were designed to keep wild mustangs contained. Even if he found a moment of opportunity, how could he break Ember and Ash out and keep them safe from the barrage of ropes and bullets? Ember sighed heavily, her breath fluttering against his muzzle. He sensed she was exhausted, her spirit battered by the day's events. But she was alive, and so far, she wasn't seriously injured. Riot nickered softly, trying to convey that he wouldn't abandon her. She nodded in her own equine way, stepping back slowly as if to say that she understood but could do nothing else. Riot heard boots crunch on gravel nearby. He flattened himself low behind a stack of crates, watching as a guard passed, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Ember retreated to blend in with the maras, her chestnut coat vanishing into the deeper shadows. He waited until the guard strolled out of sight. Then he backed away from the fence, was silent on the sandy ground. He needed to find Ash. With trembling nostrils, he moved along the perimeter, searching for a pen that might hold younger horses or colts separated from their dams. He caught glimpses of anxious yearlings, some nearly grown, but no small black colt like Ash. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Finally, in a far pen near a set of holding trailers, he heard a soft, plaintive whinny that pricked his ears. He peered inside. There, pressed against the fence with wide eyes, stood Ash. The colt was trembling from head to hoof, so small compared to the older horses around him. Riot nearly cried out with relief. He recognized his son's skinny legs and the distinctive white star on his forehead. But the greatest comfort was simply seeing the colt alive. Ash looked lost, separated from Ember, overshadowed by bigger, rowdier yearlings. His mane was tangled, and his eyes were ringed with the fear of the day's ordeal. Riot wanted to smash the fence aside and take him away right then. But one glance at the barbed wire at the top, and at the men milling around, told him he would have no chance in a direct assault. Worse, a single whinny from him could alert the guards. So he stifled the urge to call to Ash. Instead, he watched, waiting for a quiet moment to reassure his colt. Eventually, the pen calmed as the captured horses settled into an uneasy rest, all too aware they were trapped. Riot shifted slowly along the fence until he was near enough to softly exhale through the mesh. Ash lifted his head at the subtle sound. Their eyes met. The colt let out a subdued, hopeful nicker, and Riot answered in a low rumble, telling him, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Ash took a tentative step forward, pressing his delicate muzzle to the chain link. Riot touched him gently, wishing he could do more than offer a comforting sound. The bitterness of their separation burned in him, fueling his determination. He had found Ember, and he had found Ash. They were both alive, but imprisoned by men who saw them as nothing more than commodities. If Riot was going to free them, he'd have to wait for the right time. But that time might never come if the wranglers loaded them onto trailers in the morning to be driven who knew where. The notion spurred him to think fast. How could he create chaos, enough that the pens might open, enough that he and his family could slip away? The guard's flashlight beam swept across the chain link. Riot crouched down, heart hammering. Another moment, and he could be discovered. The guard paused, shining the light inside to check on the horses, who blinked in the sudden brightness. Ash shrank back, blending in with the others. Riot stayed perfectly still. After a few tense seconds, the guard continued on. Riot knew his time here was short. If he stuck around, he was bound to be seen, and once discovered, his chance of helping his family would vanish. He gently exhaled through the fence again, telling Ash that he wouldn't be gone for long. He needed a plan, though. And to find one, he needed time to think without the threat of immediate capture. Reluctantly, he slipped away, retreating to a rocky outcrop not far from the corrals, close enough that he could see the floodlights but distant enough to avoid random patrols. He tested the air. The evening breeze carried the scent of sweaty horses, men, gasoline, and hay. Riot lowered his aching body to the ground, trying to rest even as his mind raced with possibilities. The only chance he saw was to cause a massive disturbance, one that would distract the men long enough for the gates or fences to be breached. But how to do that alone? Even a stallion as strong as Riot couldn't take on an entire camp of wranglers. He needed to trust that some of the other captive horses, wild and terrified, might also try to break free if given an opening. If he could lead them. He drifted into a troubled doze, images of Ember and Ash swirling in his mind. He recalled better days, racing across the open plains with Ember at his side, Ash bounding behind in clumsy joy. He remembered standing watch at night while Ember dozed, the quiet hush of the desert broken only by nocturnal calls. Now everything had changed, in a single day of helicopter raids and metal gates. Riot's lips peeled back from his teeth in an unvoiced snarl. He refused to let that day spell the end of his family's freedom. He startled awake at the sound of an engine revving. Dawn was still an hour away, but the wranglers were already stirring, preparing to move the horses. He snapped to full alertness, ignoring the stiffness in his legs, and crept back toward the corrals. In the faint pre-dawn light, he spotted men hooking trailers to trucks, checking tire pressure, and adjusting ramps. Riot's heart sank. They were going to load the Mustang soon, perhaps in separate vehicles, separating families even further. If he didn't act, Ember and Ash might be gone forever. But how to act effectively was the question. He wouldn't be able to do this by stealth. It would require a daring assault, maybe reckless. Yet a quiet part of him spoke up, urging him to consider his own survival. One horse, alone, would be shot or roped down. But another part of him roared back that a life without Ember and Ash wasn't worth living. A primal determination surfaced, and with it came a fierce clarity. He would do whatever it took. The sun began to rise, staining the horizon with orange and pink. Wranglers moved around with coffee cups, chatting in low voices, tapping the corrals with sticks to rouse the horses and start funneling them into the loading chutes. Riot tensed, every muscle coiled. He needed a moment of vulnerability in the operation, some gap in the guard that he could exploit. He noticed a few of the older Mustangs getting frenzied at the approach of men, rearing and kicking. If enough of them panicked, perhaps they could break the fence. Riot snorted. If he could add to that panic from the outside, maybe, just maybe, the fence would buckle or the gate would be forced open. But that was only half of the plan. How could he do it fast enough to reach Ember and Ash amid the chaos? Adrenaline pulsed through him as he watched the wranglers move from one pen to another, opening gates that led into narrow chutes. Horses that resisted were whipped or prodded. Tension escalated with each passing minute. Some Mustangs tried to back away, eyes rolling with fear, hooves striking the metal walls. The men shouted curses, frustration evident. The small pen holding Ash was next in line for loading. Riot could see his Colt's ears pinned back, the whites of his eyes showing. If Riot did nothing, Ash would be driven up into a trailer and carried off. In a neighboring corral, Ember paced restlessly, her ears flicking, as if she sensed the impending separation. Riot felt that primal surge again. He left his hidden vantage point and began to move swiftly along the perimeter. Hooves scraped against gravel, but the men were too focused on the corral gates to notice him initially. He circled around to a side that faced the open desert, where a large truck was parked. If he could scare the horses in the nearest pen into a stampede, they might slam into the fence with enough force to break it. He approached the truck from the side, flattening his body as best he could, creeping behind a large trash barrel. A wrangler turned, scanning the area, but Riot froze. The man frowned, as if sensing something off, then shook his head and went back to guiding the Mustangs. Carefully, Riot inched forward, his eyes fixed on the pen full of nervous stallions. If he could rattle the fence or do something startling, the horses might react violently. His pulse hammered. He tested the truck's metal with a soft bump of his muzzle, seeing if it might clang loudly. Sure enough, it was hollow enough to make a startling noise if struck hard. Summoning his courage, Riot reared up and kicked out at the side of the truck with both hind legs. The steel reverberated like a thunderclap, echoing across the corrals. Alarmed shouts rang out from the men, and the Mustangs in the pens startled violently. The truck lurched from the impact, and Riot staggered at the recoil, wincing at the fresh pain in his flank. But the effect was immediate. The pen stallions erupted in panic, rearing and kicking against the corral walls. The entire fence rattled like it was about to come off its posts. Men shouted, some stumbling backward. Riot took the opportunity to circle around to another side, letting out a fierce neigh that reverberated with challenge. A few wranglers spotted him, exclaiming in surprise. One reached for a rope, another for a rifle. Riot didn't wait. He lunged forward with a primal scream, hooves hammering the ground. The sudden movement drew the attention of more horses in nearby pens, who whipped themselves into an even greater frenzy. The corral shook under the onslaught of terrified Mustangs slamming into it. One of the gates buckled. Two wranglers rushed to keep it shut, bracing their shoulders against the metal. Riot seized that moment to race along the fence line, searching for Ember's pen. He found it. Ember was rearing in alarm at the chaos, and the maras in her pen were swirling around in confusion. The gate was still latched, but the men had abandoned it momentarily to deal with the bigger crisis on the other side. Riot put all his strength into a kick at the gate latch. Metal clanged but held. Again, he kicked, his muscles trembling with the force of the blow, adrenaline driving away the pain. The latch bent slightly. Ember and the other maras, sensing freedom, slammed their bodies against the gate from the inside. The combined force ripped the latch free with a loud screech of metal. The gate flung wide open. Ember burst out first, nearly knocking Riot aside. She slid to a halt, recognized him, and whinnied with frantic joy. A handful of maras followed, scattering in all directions, but Riot and Ember knew their path was toward Ash. Ash's pen was guarded by two wranglers who had just noticed the brewing disaster. One lifted a rifle, aiming at Ember, but Riot thundered toward him, ears pinned flat, eyes blazing. The man hesitated, fear flickering across his face. In that split second, Ember slammed into his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry. The other wrangler rushed to grab the rope, but Riot snapped at him, teeth grazing fabric. The man cursed and stumbled backward, dropping the rope to clutch his arm. Emboldened, Ember rushed to the pen that held Ash. The small colt was pressed against the fence, eyes wild with terror. She began striking at the latch with her hooves, but it refused to budge. Riot whirled, about to help, when another wrangler closed in, ropes spinning overhead. With a savage snort, Riot reared and kicked out with his front legs, forcing the man to leap back to avoid a crushed skull. The rope flew harmlessly aside, tangling in the dirt. Riot landed heavily, leg muscles screaming in protest, but there was no time to nurse his wounds. Ember needed help. He spun around to the gate, scanning for a latch or a chain. Indeed, there was a heavy chain looped through the metal. Riot grabbed the chain in his teeth, tugging with ferocious determination. It resisted, biting into his gums, but he jerked again. The chain rattled, slipping an inch. Ember joined in, slamming her shoulder into the gate with all her might. The combined stress snapped the metal post, and the chain slipped free with a jolt. Ash burst out, nearly toppling forward when the barrier gave way. Riot quickly pressed his muzzle to the colt, reassuring him with a soft snort. The precious reunion lasted only a heartbeat before the reality of their situation crashed back in. Chaos reigned everywhere. Several pens were now open, and mustangs were fleeing in every direction. Wranglers, overwhelmed, tried to wrangle them back, shouting frantically into radios for backup. A helicopter roared overhead, blades whipping up a sandstorm. Riot realized they needed to get clear of the corrals before the big guns came out. He nipped Ember's flank, urging her and Ash to follow. The three bolted toward the open desert. Every step jarred Riot's wounded flank, but he forced himself forward, ignoring the hot slick of blood that dampened his coat. Gunshots crackled behind them, but the pen area was so crowded with panicked horses that the men risked hitting their own herd. Riot heard bullets whiz past, sending showers of sand into the air, but none struck home. He tore across the desert, hooves drumming a fierce rhythm. Ember raced beside him, her eyes filled with fierce joy and desperate fear. Ash struggled to keep pace, his spindly legs moving in frantic bursts. Riot and Ember slowed just enough to keep him in their protective shadow, not daring to leave him behind. They had escaped the immediate ring of corrals, but the helicopter soared overhead, searching the dusty plain for the fleeing mustangs. Riot glanced up, heart pounding. He spotted a line of low hills to the west. If they could reach them, they might find cover in the rugged foothills where vehicles and helicopters had a harder time maneuvering. He snorted a warning to Ember, and they angled their flight toward the hills, the sun beginning to rise behind them. The ground sloped upward, littered with rocks and scrub brush. The helicopter's engine bellowed, swinging around to cut them off. Riot tossed his head, stepping nimbly around jagged stones. Ember grunted as she navigated a path for Ash, who stumbled but stayed upright. The helicopter swooped lower, a swirling cloud of grit blinding them momentarily. Riot grit his teeth, powering through. They emerged onto a narrow path that wound between two boulder-strewn slopes. The chopper soared overhead, but the path was too tight for it to follow effectively. In frustration, the pilot swung the aircraft around to find another vantage point, but Riot and Ember used those precious moments to climb deeper into the labyrinth of ridges. They galloped until their muscles burned and their lungs felt ready to burst. When they finally slowed, panting hard, the helicopter's roar had faded somewhat, replaced by the hush of the high desert. Riot's ears flicked, scanning for any sign of pursuit on foot. Nothing. They had created such a bedlam behind them that the wranglers would have their hands full recapturing whatever mustangs they could. That chaos was the only reason Riot and his family had gotten out. He exhaled, legs trembling, and turned his muzzle to check on Ash. The colt's eyes still glistened with terror, but he was alive, No visible injuries except for a shallow scrape on one knee. Ember stood beside him, chest heaving, but otherwise intact. For a moment, father, mother, and Colt stood in silence, breathing in the sweet air of freedom. Riot stepped closer, pressing his head against Ember's neck. She returned the gesture with a gentle touch of her muzzle, and then both turned to nuzzle Ash, who leaned heavily against them, shivering from the ordeal. Emotions welled up in Riot: relief, gratitude, and a lingering fury at the men who had dared to tear them apart. But now they were together again, safe, for the moment. A distant gunshot echoed from the plains, reminding them that the danger was not fully gone. The men might still come for them. They were wounded, exhausted, and vulnerable in this wild terrain. Survival was not guaranteed. With a determined snort, Riot set off deeper into the hills, leading his family. They needed water, shelter, and a chance to recover from their injuries. The desert had always been both a harsh adversary and a loyal ally to wild horses. They would draw upon the land's hidden resources, find a secluded spot to nurse their wounds and regain their strength. Step by painful step, they pressed onward, forging their path over rocky inclines and through narrow passes that shielded them from prying eyes. Each minute they remained undiscovered was a small victory. Pain flared in Riot's flank, forcing him to limp occasionally, but Ember and Ash stayed close. Ember would pause to nuzzle his wound, as though trying to soothe it with her gentle breath. Ash, though frightened and tired, gamely struggled to keep up. They pressed on until the sun was high overhead, scorching them from a brilliant blue sky. At last they found a small ravine where a trickle of water flowed among reeds and moss. It was a mirage of relief. Riot lowered his head and drank, the lukewarm water tasting like the sweetest nectar. Ember and Ash drank as well, quenching the thirst that had built from their desperate flight. The shallow stream beckoned them to linger. Riot carefully lowered himself, letting the water lap at his hooves and wash away some of the dust and dried blood. Ember joined, and Ash stood, unsure, until Riot nudged him forward. The Colt stepped in, splashing awkwardly, and for the first time since their capture, they shared a fleeting sense of solace in each other's presence. Yet they couldn't linger indefinitely. The men might search, though the ruggedness of this terrain would deter some. As the afternoon wore on, Riot led them higher into the rocky hills. They navigated winding paths lined with juniper and pinyon pine. The scent of resin and dust filled the air, and the temperature began to drop slightly as they climbed. Once, they startled a family of deer, sending them bounding away into the undergrowth. The hours passed, and with no immediate sign of pursuit, they allowed themselves a moment's rest among some scattered boulders where the shade offered a reprieve from the sun. Riot took stock of his wound. It was crusted over, but every step reopened it slightly, oozing blood. Ember licked it, and though it stung, Riot appreciated her care. Ash dozed fitfully, head drooping. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them all, but relief and gratitude shone in Ember's eyes whenever she glanced at Riot. He had come for them, defied every danger, and they were free. For now, that was all that mattered. They awoke at dusk to the deepening shadows creeping across the hills. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the subtle promise of a cooler night. Riot rose stiffly, letting out a quiet neigh to rouse Ember and Ash. They needed to keep moving, to put more distance between themselves and the captivity they had just escaped. Ember stood, shaking dust from her coat. Ash blinked awake, following closely. Together they set out again, forging a path under the gathering stars. Though night brought some respite from the scorching sun, it brought its own dangers. The darkness concealed cougars and coyotes, and the rocky terrain was treacherous. More than once, Ash stumbled on loose gravel, sending pebbles clattering down an unseen drop. Riot, mindful of his son's inexperience, slowed their pace. Every so often, he caught the glimmer of eyes reflecting starlight from a hidden vantage point. Whether predator or harmless night creature, he couldn't be sure. His heart thrummed with vigilance. He knew from experience that cougars would gladly target a weakened stallion or a young colt. At midnight they found a sheltered ledge halfway up a steep incline. Too narrow for most predators to approach without warning, it provided a measure of safety. Riot guided Ember and Ash onto it, and they pressed together for warmth. The memory of the corral's claustrophobic walls haunted them still, but here, at least, no chains held them. The sky stretched wide above, a brilliant tapestry of stars. Ember nickered softly, a tremor in her voice. Riot understood. Their family was together, but the world still felt precarious. He offered a reassuring nuzzle, closing his eyes to rest. The night passed without major incident, though Ember startled awake more than once, ears pricked at some distant sound. Each time, Riot lifted his head, scanning the darkness. Nothing came of it, and so they slept again, lulled by exhaustion. At dawn, they woke to find faint rays of sunlight creeping across the rugged landscape below. Riot rose, carefully testing his flank. The wound stung but felt better than before, no fresh blood stained his coat. Ember's injuries were minor bruises, a few scrapes. Ash seemed unhurt, except for the emotional scars of the ordeal. He hovered close to his parents, still shaken, but with each new day of freedom, hope returned to his eyes. They continued their journey, traveling along ridges and descending when they found pockets of vegetation or water. Days passed in a blur of cautious travel, rest, and vigilance. They encountered scattered wildlife, desert hare darting across the rocks, a hawk circling above, occasionally a coyote that skulked at the edge of sight, evaluating whether they were worth stalking. Riot's presence, formidable and protective, usually dissuaded attacks, but once or twice a coyote pack tested them. Riot would charge, bellowing a challenge, lashing out with hooves and teeth. The coyotes would scatter, though they trailed at a distance, waiting for a moment of weakness. At one point, Ash ventured too far from Ember's side, and Riot spun to herd him back, nipping him gently as a warning. Ash flinched, uncertain, but he needed to learn discipline in this perilous environment. Riot whinnied softly, making sure Ash understood that it was for his safety. Ember gazed at her mate with pride, acknowledging his leadership. They followed the ridge until they came upon a stretch of desert that opened to a broad valley. From their vantage point, they saw a scattering of shrubs and the glint of a stream snaking through the valley floor. It looked like a promising place to rest, but also potentially inhabited by other herds, or humans. Riot studied it carefully, ears perked. The breeze carried no immediate scent of men, but he smelled the faint musk of wild horses. A moment of tension rippled through him. If another stallion ruled that valley, a confrontation might await them. Yet water was essential, and the valley offered more abundant forage than the sparse ridges they had been traversing. They descended cautiously. The closer they got, the more signs of horse presence they found, hoofprints in the soft dust, bent grasses where a herd had grazed. Before long, they spotted the shapes of wild horses near the stream, maybe a dozen or so. Ember and Ash paused, gazing at them from a distance. Riot could sense Ember's longing for the security of a larger group, but he also knew how challenging it could be to join an established herd. The lead stallion might reject him, or see him as a rival. He led Ember and Ash to a small stand of cottonwoods near the water, partially shielded from direct view. They drank, refreshing themselves. The water was clear and cool, a blessing after the dusty hills. Ember's sigh of relief was almost audible as she lapped at the stream. Riot stood guard, scanning for any sign of hostility. One of the other horses, a lookout mare, perhaps, raised her head and spotted them. She let out a warning whinny, and the rest of the herd froze, heads lifting in sudden alert. The lead stallion, a massive gray with a sweeping tail, broke from the group and trotted forward, ears pinned, posture aggressive. Riot felt his muscles tense. He was in no state to fight a vigorous stallion. His wound was still healing, and Ember and Ash were in no condition for a prolonged clash. But the gray advanced, snorting, stamping his hoof. Riot's instincts flared, telling him to defend his family if necessary. He stepped forward, head held high, though he kept his ears neutral, trying to signal he wasn't spoiling for a fight. The gray stallion, however, pawed the ground aggressively. Riot realized this newcomer saw him as a direct threat to his maras. Ember and Ash remained behind Riot, who let out a calm but firm snort. He had no intention of challenging the herd or stealing the gray's maras. He just wanted safety and resources for his own small family. Yet the Grey was determined to enforce his dominance. He charged forward, teeth bared. Riot danced to the side, wincing as pain flared in his flank. He whirled, prepared to kick if the Grey pressed the attack. Emboldened, the bigger stallion lunged, trying to bite Riot's neck. Riot snapped back, their teeth clacking. Ember reared in alarm, and Ash dashed to her side for protection. For several tense moments, the two stallions circled each other, snorting and stomping the ground, each seeking an advantage. Riot's heart hammered. This was the last thing they needed after escaping the Wranglers. But the Grey was unyielding, a fierce guardian of his territory. Riot recognized that even if he won this fight, it would cost him precious energy, and might reopen his wound. He tried once more to convey with body language that he meant no harm. The Grey, however, either didn't understand or didn't care. He charged again, and Riot had no choice but to defend himself. Their bodies collided, sending a shock of impact through Riot's ribs. The Grey was larger, but Riot was fast, and he twisted away, lashing out with his hind legs. A glancing blow struck the Grey's shoulder, forcing him to back off with a squeal. The stallion glared at Riot, ears flattened, tail lashing in frustration. Yet he didn't retreat fully. Riot braced, ready for another onslaught, muzzle flecked with foam as adrenaline coursed through him. The clash was a brutal possibility, but Riot's priority was Ember and Ash, not winning territory. Before the Grey could muster another charge, a sharp cry echoed across the valley, followed by an odd hush that descended over everything. Riot and the Grey turned their heads in the same instant. At the far end of the valley, emerging from a stand of sagebrush, was a mountain lion. The predator's golden eyes locked onto the group of horses. Panic rippled through the herd like a wave. Mara's whinnied colts scrambled. The Grey stallion instantly shifted from aggressor to protector, dashing back toward his herd. Riot froze, heart pounding. They were all vulnerable, especially Ash, who was still so young. In that split second of terror, Riot recognized a chance to slip away. The Grey was no longer concerned about chasing away intruders. His focus was on shielding his own herd from the cougar. Riot whinnied sharply to Ember, who hurried to flank Ash. With the lion stalking closer, they needed to decide, run for higher ground, or stay and fight if cornered. The rest of the herd erupted into a stampede of fear, galloping across the open space. The lion crouched low, eyes calculating. Riot knew a single Mustang could hold its own against a lion under certain circumstances, but Ash would be at terrible risk. He pressed his muzzle to Ember's neck, urging her to follow as he led them at a gallop along the stream's edge, away from the main herd. The lion might target the bigger group or look for any stragglers. Riot just needed to ensure it didn't single out Ash. His hooves thundered on the soft ground, Ember and Ash keeping pace behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. The cougar was in pursuit, low to the ground, bounding with powerful strides. The bigger herd scattered to the left, sending up plumes of dust. The lion could choose any target, but for now, it seemed to fix on Riot's small family. A jolt of fear shot through him. This was the unstoppable cruelty of the wild. The predators singled out the colt. Their only chance was to stay ahead, to use agility and cunning. They veered toward the outer rim of the valley, where the ground rose in a natural ramp. Riot led the way up an incline strewn with rocks. Perhaps among the boulders they could find a vantage that would thwart a cougar's sprint. Ember breathed heavily, guiding Ash with her body, pushing him to keep running even as his legs faltered. Riot felt a surge of relief when he spotted a narrow gap between large rocks at the top of the incline, forming a kind of chute. If they could slip in, the cougar would have to approach from a single narrow angle, nullifying its advantage of stealth attacks from the side. Riot angled toward it, hooves scrambling on loose scree. The lion was close enough now that he heard its heavy breathing. Ash yelped as he nearly lost his footing, and Ember slowed to steady him. Riot circled back, letting out a fierce neigh, warning the cougar to back off. The predator snarled, slowing its pursuit for a moment, uncertain whether to pounce or hold. Taking advantage of that hesitation, Riot herded Ember and Ash into the rocky gap. The space was tight, with jagged walls on either side, but it was big enough for the three of them to stand. Riot took position at the mouth of the gap, ears pinned, chest heaving. The cougar paced outside, tail flicking ominously. They locked eyes, wild stallion versus cunning cat. Neither wanted to yield. Riot stomped, sending a cascade of pebbles rolling down the slope. The lion crouched, muscles tensing for a leap, but it must have realized that launching into a narrow crevice with the thrashing stallion's hooves was a lethal gamble. It growled, prowling back and forth, searching for a weakness. Time stretched on in a standoff, each second thick with tension. Ember and Ash pressed back against the rocky wall, the colt trembling. Riot's heart hammered, but his gaze never wavered from the lion. He knew if he turned away, even for an instant, the cat might strike. The stalemate continued until, from somewhere down in the valley, a frantic whinny and the thunder of hooves diverted the cougar's attention. Another part of the herd must have been scattering, or possibly another horse had stumbled. Seizing the distraction, the cat turned its head, scanning the commotion. Riot let out a thunderous neigh, rearing up within the gap to make himself as large as possible. That was enough to spook the cougar into abandoning this particular hunt. With a snarling hiss, it sprang away down the slope, disappearing behind a stand of juniper. Riot's legs threatened to buckle from the rush of relief. He lowered himself back onto all fours, chest heaving. Ember stepped forward to nuzzle him, and Ash gingerly followed, still trembling. They were safe, for now. But the day had already tested their limits, and they were far from any lasting security. The memory of the lion's glare lingered with them as they found a safer nook a bit farther up the ridge to rest. Days turned into weeks as they continued their trek through the rugged territory, seeking a place they could call home, someplace hidden from the reach of men. The environment itself was unforgiving, blistering heat by day, chilling winds by night, predators lurking in every shadow. Riot's flank healed gradually, scarring over. Ember's bruises faded. Ash, though still shaken, grew steadier on his legs and more alert. The ordeal of captivity and the narrow escape had etched a new wariness into him, perhaps accelerating the process by which a young horse learns the brutal realities of survival. They traveled over high passes, picking their way through rocky crags, descending into brushy valleys. When water was scarce, they plodded on grimly, lips cracked with thirst. When they found a hidden spring, they drank their fill, letting the tension ease for a few precious hours. On more than one occasion, they caught the distant whir of an aircraft, and they'd freeze, hearts in their throats, until the sound vanished. They gradually made their way into a region of rolling hills and scattered woodlands, a place that seemed less traveled by man. The grass grew thicker here, the streams a little more reliable. Occasionally, they saw signs of other horses, hoofprints and droppings, but never encountered another large herd. Once or twice, a lone stallion or small band appeared, only to vanish upon noticing Riot and his family. Riot felt an immense relief that no one challenged him, not wanting a repeat of the confrontation with the gray stallion. Ember gradually relaxed, enjoying the lush patches of grass. Ash found a new spark of youthful energy, romping around in cautious play. Riot always kept watch, scanning for the slightest hint of threat. He never forgot that a helicopter or a group of wranglers could appear at any moment. The modern world had ways of intruding upon the most remote wilderness. At last, after many days of wandering, they discovered a valley that felt especially serene. Surrounded by tall cliffs on three sides, it had a single narrow entrance that would be easily defensible. A clear stream cut through the center, nourishing thick grass. Stands of aspen and pine offered shade and shelter. It looked like a paradise. Riot took the lead, testing the ground, checking the perimeter for signs of predators or human presence. Finding only deer and the faint aroma of an old campsite from long ago, he led Ember and Ash inside. They drank from the stream, waded among the reeds, tasting the sweet grass. Something about this valley felt like a safe haven. They spent the next few days roaming the valley's perimeter, exploring hidden nooks. They found a sheltered dell where the grass grew thickest, a patch of pine that could shield them from harsh winter winds, and even a small cave in the cliffs, suitable for short-term refuge if a storm hit. After the countless hardships, it was as though the land was finally offering them a gentle respite. Riot, who had always been most at ease in the open desert, found himself marveling at the abundance of green. Ember appeared to revel in it, rolling happily in soft grass, and Ash took daring runs across the open space, stretching his young legs without fear of immediate danger. For the first time in what felt like ages, they could simply exist without perpetual flight or fighting. Yet Riot's vigilance never fully abated. He would stand on a slight rise, ears pricked, watching the horizon. Sometimes he caught himself flinching at a distant sound that vaguely resembled the thunder of helicopter blades. Other times, his body tensed at the memory of the chain-link fences and the men with ropes. But day after day passed without intrusion. The nights brought only natural sounds, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the breeze whispering through pines. Slowly, the tension in his body eased. A scab fell from his flank, revealing fresh pink skin beneath. Ember and Ash grazed contentedly. In this haven, they found new routines. Ember spent her time teaching Ash the ways of the land, how to sense changes in weather by the wind, how to avoid hidden burrows that could trap a hoof, how to pick the sweetest grasses near the stream. Riot stood watch, patrolling the boundaries of the valley every morning and evening, marking it as his domain. He was no fool. Any day, another stallion or even a group of wranglers might appear. But for now, they claimed it as their sanctuary, a place to heal and build a life. One afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, dark and heavy. Thunder rumbled across the cliffs, echoing like distant drums. Ash pranced anxiously, remembering the time as a newborn when a storm had terrified him. Riot gently guided him beneath a copse of trees, while Ember pressed close, comforting him with her warm body. The heavens opened, and a drenching rain fell, turning the stream into a rushing torrent. The three huddled together, letting the rain wash the dust from their coats. It was cold, but also oddly cleansing. The memory of the corral, the gunshots, the lion's stalking gaze, each seemed washed away by the downpour. When the storm finally passed, the valley sparkled with refreshed life. Water dripped from leaves, forming tiny jeweled droplets on every branch. The stream ran fuller, and puddles glistened in low spots. Ember and Ash playfully splashed in a shallow overflow, and Riot joined them, feeling a rare joy welling in his chest. He had them back. He had fought for them, risked everything, and here they stood, free and alive. The endless nightmares of captivity seemed far behind, though not forgotten. Time blurred as the weeks turned into what felt like a season of relative peace. Riot's flank wound fully healed, leaving only a faint scar as a reminder. Ember's coat shone with health as she grazed on the lush grasses. Ash grew taller, stronger, learning the ways of the valley. He pranced and played, sometimes challenging Riot in mock battles, only to be gently nudged aside by his father's superior strength. Each playful skirmish built the young colt's confidence. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the cliffs in fiery oranges and purples, Riot led Ember and Ash to the highest point of the valley's ridge, a spot where they could see far into the distance. The sky stretched endlessly, stars just beginning to peek through the fading twilight. Ember nudged Riot's shoulder, as if to ask what he was looking for. Riot lifted his head, scanning the wide horizon. He saw no trucks, no billowing dust from engines, no dark speck of helicopters in the sky. Nothing. Only the vast wilderness, silent except for the whisper of the wind. Ember pressed close, and Ash came to stand on Riot's other side. Together, they gazed into the distance, a small family that had endured trials beyond measure. Riot lowered his head, exhaling a soft breath. They had survived the roundup, the corral, the bullets, the chase, the lion, the relentless challenges of the wild. Through it all, their bond had guided them, an unbreakable thread of loyalty and love. They lingered there until the last rays of sunlight vanished, replaced by the shimmering glow of moonlight. Finally, Ember turned away, guiding Ash back toward the safety of the valley floor. Riot followed, satisfied that, for now, no threat loomed. This was home, or as close to a true home as a wild Mustang family could claim. Under the moon, they grazed, occasionally lifting their heads to listen to the sounds of night. A distant coyote called, but it felt far off, not an immediate menace. Crickets sang in the grass, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Riot's heart felt light. For the first time since the day of that violent roundup, he allowed himself to simply be, without scanning every shadow. Some hours later, Ember and Ash curled up together to rest. Riot remained standing, gazing at them with quiet reverence. He remembered the terror of seeing Ember behind the fence, the frantic moment when Ash was alone in another pen. He recalled the sting of the bullet graze, the helicopter's roar, the frantic escapes, and the uncertainty in every step of their journey. Now, in this place, they found a reprieve, a chance to heal and be a family again. As dawn broke the next day, golden lights spilled across the valley. Ember stretched her limbs and trotted to Riot's side. Ash bounded after her, brimming with morning energy. Together, they visited the stream, drank, and took a leisurely walk around the perimeter. The valley was alive with birdsong. Flowers dotted the grass here and there, splashes of color among the green. If they had not lived through the trials, they might never have found this slice of paradise. Though they knew the wild could turn harsh at any moment, storms, predators, or the return of human threat, they savored every peaceful second. In time, they might welcome other Mustangs who ventured in, or they might stay solitary. The future was uncertain, but one thing remained clear: they had each other. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a rhythm of life in the valley. The days were filled with grazing, the occasional playful gallop, and always the watchful eye on the horizon. At times, Riot would trot up the ridge alone, scanning for signs of men, only to return with a gentle nicker of reassurance that all was well. Ember would whinny softly, and Ash would romp over to greet him. Their herd was small, just 3, but it was a herd bound by an ordeal that had tested them at every turn. Eventually, on a still evening, a faint whir in the distance made Riot's blood run cold. He snapped his head up, ears swiveling. Ember froze as well, tension rippling through her. Ash picked up on their fear, stepping close. The noise grew slightly, then faded. Perhaps just an airplane passing miles away, not the dreaded helicopter. Riot's heart hammered until the sound disappeared completely. The valley remained safe. Yet it reminded them that the world outside their sanctuary hadn't vanished. The threat of capture, the scarring memory of chains and men, still lingered as a possibility. But this time, they were stronger, bonded by adversity, and determined never to be taken again. The next morning, the sun rose on a renewed sense of gratitude. Ash raced through the meadow, chasing a startled rabbit, only to bound back to Ember when the rabbit disappeared into the brush. Ember grazed contentedly, and Riot roamed the perimeter. He smelled no intruders, heard no sign of trouble. He felt an odd peace settle in his chest. This was survival in its truest sense, forging a life in a land that challenged and nourished them in equal measure, forging unbreakable ties of family through every danger. Riot watched Ember as she lifted her head, ears perked at the gentle rustle of leaves. She glanced at him, a soft glimmer in her eyes. In that moment, he felt a surge of love so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. He stepped over to nuzzle her, and Ash came trotting up to wedge himself happily between them. The triad stood in contentment, aware of all they had overcome. Though the wild would always be dangerous, though storms and predators would come, and though men might yet return, they had this moment of safety and unity. Riot let out a low, contented neigh. Ember answered, pressing against him. Ash whickered in delight. This was the reward for their harrowing escape and endless struggle. They had defied the odds, kept their family intact, and claimed the freedom that was their birthright. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We bring powerful survival stories to you every day.